Hi, I'm Heather Nani, and tonight we're talking about Clarice Lispector's The Fifth Story. I'm really excited to talk about Lispector, first of all because she's really famous in South America, but she's not as known here in the United States, which is really a shame because her work is fascinating. I like to talk about her as a person as well, because although her life was interesting, it's her internal world that's so fascinating to me. Lispector was born in 1920 in the West Ukraine to a Jewish family, and her parents, they moved to Brazil because of the persecution of Jews in the Ukraine. Her mom had been raped, her mom had contracted syphilis. They moved to Brazil, and when Clarice was 9, her mom had passed away. They lived in Recife, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and then they moved to Rio de Janeiro. Lispector, at the time, she went to law school when she was in her early 20s, which was unusual. First of all, because if I'm right, I think there was maybe one Jewish student, which was her, and 3 other women enrolled in her school. While she was there, however, she started writing. She left law school, started to work as a journalist. There's this mystique around Lispector that, she was said to be interested in the occult. She had a strange way about her, maybe a bit off-putting. She was reserved. She was glamorous. She was compared to, and I forget who said it, she's like Marlene Dietrich. She looks like Marlene Dietrich, but she writes like Virginia Woolf. Later in life, it was said that she had a way of alienating friends, but she was an avant-garde writer, and you can see in her works that she had this interesting, disturbed world of the mind that came out through her writing. If you look her up on YouTube, and there's I don't know if it's the last or the only actual video recording of her in an interview. It was done in 1977. Unfortunately, she also died in 1977 of ovarian cancer. And you get a real nice feel for her. There's a sadness to her. There's a vulnerability to her. There's a darkness to her. And I ask you to forgive me because this time I'm going to use notes because I don't want to miss anything, and I don't trust my brain right now. So there's a few quotes of Lispector's that I think are really interesting when she's talking about her fears. She was a woman that had a lot of fears, and she had said that the illogical nature of my fears fascinates me, gives me an aura which can be disconcerting. I can barely conceal beneath this modest smile my extraordinary gift for succumbing to fear. And you see that in her writing. The word disconcerting is interesting because she can be disconcerting. Most of her works, her works are almost always about women and women's place in society, whether they fit, whether they don't, the struggles that women have, but it's also a lot about the fear of your true self that comes through in her writing, which you'll see in the 5th story. She also said, because I had mentioned Virginia Woolf, she is often compared to Virginia Woolf, and I've got to say she threw some shade at Woolf, which was not very nice. What was it? She doesn't like to be compared to Woolf because Woolf ended up giving up, and the terrible duty is to go to the end, which I would say is unfair, but that shows you a little bit of her personality as well. She had a tendency towards depression. If you see that interview that I mentioned, you'll see it there. That said, let's talk about the 5th story. The 5th story, and you can get it online, so please do. Please get it, read it, and then listen to this. It's 7 paragraphs. That's it. 7 paragraphs of what I would say brilliance. The story is about a woman who has cockroaches in her apartment, and she kills them. It begins with, and I don't want to lose the quote, it begins with her saying that this is really 5 stories, but they're all the same story, but it could really be 1,001 stories if she were granted 1,001 nights. Right there, right out of the gate, she's referencing 1,001 Nights, the Arabian Nights. You think back, because the story is recursive. It's a frame story, right? Where you have the narrator talking about, I'm going to tell you these stories, and they're all the same. And it harkens back to like the Scheherazade. You know, Arabian Nights, Scheherazade, who has to keep telling her husband a different story every night that never ends to prevent herself from being beheaded in the morning. And so the way the fifth story works is within these 7 paragraphs, you have Lispector retelling a story, and it's poetic in its structure because the stories start out, in the beginning, the paragraphs start out small. And then as she develops the story, each time she goes back to tell it, the paragraphs actually expand in the sentences that she's using. It always begins with the title of the story is, and there's a certain phrasing that repeats itself with each paragraph, at least the first 3 paragraphs. So it's this reshaping and this developing of a story until the story kind of collapses on itself. Well, let's get into each paragraph, and then I'll explain that, I think, a little better than I just did. So we have this the beginning of the story, where she's referencing Arabian Nights, Scheherazade. I mean, she doesn't say it outright, but we get to the second paragraph, and it's called she says, this is the first story, and the title is How to Kill Cockroaches. And then she goes on to say that a woman gives her a recipe to kill the cockroaches in her apartment. It's very sterile, it's very matter of fact. You have a woman in an apartment who's got cockroaches, she finds them gross, doesn't even say that, and she wants to kill them. So Lispector, when she begins her second story, she says, the next story is really the first. It is called The Killing. It begins like this. I'm complaining about the cockroaches, and a woman heard me complain. She never places the responsibility of the recipe on the other woman. At this point, it's shifted a little bit. She's just talking about these cockroaches. This woman hears her complain. Then she goes on to say that they're not really her cockroaches. They belonged to the ground floor. She lures them up with this mixture of flour and sugar and gypsum. And the story expands in the way I believe the narrator sees her purpose in killing these cockroaches. It's no longer, I'm killing these cockroaches, they're in my apartment, they're disgusting. She starts to use this phrase, on our behalf. On our behalf, I lure these cockroaches upstairs, and on our behalf, I mix this recipe. And then when the cockroaches come, they become mine. Suddenly, the story expands where 1 minute it's about just a woman in an apartment with cockroaches that she wants to kill, to a woman who's working on the behalf of who? Humanity, everyone in the apartment, and waging war on pretty much the cockroaches of the world. The language gets much more aggressive. She starts to say things like vague loathing. She has a sense of outrage as she's mixing up this concoction, the evil secret which eroded such a tranquil household, evil secrets. Now, the thing about gypsum is, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, is what it did is it pretty much would freeze up the insides of the cockroach, right? And so she says, eroded the insides. It was a prolonged death. She had anger, fear. She wanted to kill every cockroach. And then during the night, I'd kill them, and on our behalf at the end, it was beginning to grow light. So the story really takes this twisted turn by, what is it, the third paragraph, which she's in the second story, The Killing. This woman feels anger, and somehow everything seems to not be so much about the cockroaches. Then we see that the light starts to come up, and the she hears the crow. Okay, at the end of each of these stories, she says the cockerel crow. Okay, so the rooster. You hear the rooster. Now, by the time we get to the third story, which is the largest paragraph of these 7, suddenly she's talking about the story. She kind of truncates the beginning. It's not really, she kind of mentions, how does it go? It begins with me saying I've been complaining about cockroaches. The same woman appears on the scene. She never says anything about the recipe. Now it's morning. And suddenly we see that the language shifts that Lispector chooses to use. Suddenly the language becomes much more poetic. There's a lot more imagery. You know, she starts to talk about the shadows of dawn. There's a purplish hue which distances everything at my feet, patches of light and shade. So basically what she does is she kills these cockroaches, you know, during the night. She gets up in the morning and she walks into her living room or wherever she is and finds just corpses of cockroaches everywhere. And she says it's like the breaking of dawn over Pompeii, right? And so she sees these creatures that have basically just been asphyxiated by this concoction that they've consumed. She goes on to talk about the torment, you know, the torturous death that they suffered. And you don't see that there's a lot of remorse, but you start to see her understanding what's going on in herself a bit by this third story, as she calls it. And at the end, she says, dawn breaks and she watches the destruction of the world. But also when we get to this largest paragraph, this third story, she's talking about the darkness within herself that she's recognizing. And she's saying this destruction of the world where she's not really talking about cockroaches anymore, I wouldn't say. So by the fifth paragraph, Lispector says, the fourth story is a new era in the household. And this is the paragraph where the paragraphs start to shrink, where in the third story, she's talking about this war that she's raging. It's big against her, humanity, against these cockroaches. By the fourth story, she starts to look back into herself. And she talks in this paragraph, speaks in this paragraph about her own depravity. And should she continue this nightly ritual of mixing this substance and killing the cockroaches, she refers to herself as a witch, that she's depraved. In the last sentence, she says, she compares the hardening gypsum to the depravity of existence which would shatter my internal form. So she's doing this really cruel act. And then she's questioning what's going on within myself. Finally, by the sixth paragraph, and it's quite short, she says, it almost reminds me of Frost's, you know, which path to take. She questions, what is she to do? She has to either sacrifice herself or this soul, or her soul. And she makes a decision, and she puts up a sign that says, this house has been disinfected. Which is an interesting turn of events, that the house has been disinfected, because it doesn't seem to be a rejection of what had happened, but it seems to be a suggestion that it's not going to happen any longer. By the time we get to the seventh paragraph, which is the fifth story, things take a very unusual turn. And Lispector says, this should be titled Leibniz and the Transcendence of Love in Polynesia. It begins like this: I was complaining about the cockroaches. Now, some people will say that that is just about, you know, titles mean nothing. You can't trust a story. The fifth story is Lispector's indictment of writing and the truth that can be told through writing. However, Lispector is a very calculated writer, and when you look at the themes found in the fifth story, these are the themes that you find throughout most of her work. Gottfried Leibniz was the German Enlightenment mathematician and philosopher. I'm not a mathematician, so I just have kind of a superficial understanding of this. But he was credited with discovering the binary number system in the late 1800s. However, later it was said that the Polynesians discovered that without getting credit back in the 1400s. There was also something about transcendental mathematics that you ignore the higher order of things, and that's not my jam. But if we're looking, there's something to that final title, I think, that's more than Lispector just coming up with nonsense. It has something to do with what is the higher order of things. Is it the human need to destroy something that inconveniences it? In the end, did the higher order prevail where it was? I wouldn't say it was an act of love that she stopped disinfecting the house, if she did. But if we're to interpret that the fourth story, that the house was disinfected, that she stopped killing cockroaches, that maybe the higher order of things did prevail, or did I don't know. That's for you and everyone else to decide. So anyway, if you like this, please like and subscribe and read some more Clarice, because she's interesting and brilliant, and let me know what you think.